You clicked on this video. You gave me a shot, even though my channel is small. And for that, I'm beyond grateful. So here's my promise to you. Stick around, and I won't let you down. Got an idea for a new scary story? Be the first to comment, and I'll write the next one exactly how you want it. That's my way of saying thanks. Now turn the lights down, and let's get into it. This is a ride you won't forget. It started as a fun road trip, the kind we'd been planning for weeks. The four of us, me, my fiancée Sarah, and our best friends Eric and Jessica, were heading to a music festival 2 states away. Eric, of course, was the one who convinced us to take his old beat-up van instead of renting something more reliable. He called it vintage. It was really just an excuse to play DJ and blast his terrible taste in music the entire way. Jessica, his younger sister, was the only one brave enough to argue with him. She sat next to Sarah in the back seat, shooting sarcastic comments over the roar of the speakers, while Sarah leaned against me, her hand on my shoulder. We'd been together for 6 years, and in just a few months, she'd be my wife. Sarah was the calm in my chaos, the voice of reason when I needed it. And right now, she was giving me a look that said, Eric's gonna drive us all insane before we even get there. All right, Eric yelled from the passenger seat, cranking up the volume. What's the first thing we do when we get there? Funnel a beer? Mosh pit? Tattoos? Find better friends, Jessica shot back. I couldn't help but laugh. It was moments like these that made the long drive worth it. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the energy in the van had shifted. The roads grew narrower, and the trees on either side of us seemed to close in. We'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, and the GPS wasn't helping, just a spinning circle and the words, "No signal." We should have hit a highway junction by now, Sarah said, staring at the printed map on her lap. Maybe it's that dirt road we passed a few miles back, Eric suggested, leaning forward. Looked sketchy as hell, but hey, sketchy usually means fun, right? Yeah, or it means we get murdered, Jessica muttered. The gas light flickered on, and an uneasy silence fell over us. All right, we'll keep going a bit farther, I said. But if we don't find something soon, we'll turn back. That's when we saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road like a ghost. Pale, barefoot, her white dress streaked with mud. For a split second, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a coyote. But as I hit the brakes, the headlights illuminated her face. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with wild, tangled hair and eyes that darted toward the dark trees on either side of the road. Jesus, Eric muttered, sitting up. Should we stop? She looks hurt, Sarah said, her voice soft but urgent. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The girl stepped forward cautiously, her bare feet crunching against the gravel. Her eyes flicked to me, then to Sarah, then back to me. You need to leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What? Sarah leaned out the window. Are you okay? Do you need help? They already know you're here, the girl said, her voice trembling. They see everything. Before we could ask what she meant, she turned and ran into the woods, her silhouette swallowed by the darkness. 15 minutes later, we saw the lights. They flickered through the trees, soft, golden glows that reminded me of campfires. As we drove closer, we saw a cluster of buildings, a large farmhouse surrounded by smaller cabins and a towering barn. Lanterns hung from the porches, their warm light dancing in the cool night air. Well, Eric said, this isn't creepy at all. We're almost out of gas, Jessica pointed out. We don't really have a choice. I think it's kind of charming, Sarah said, her tone optimistic. I pulled into the dirt lot near the farmhouse and killed the engine. Before I could even step out, a man emerged from the front porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a weathered face that radiated kindness. His smile was wide, his arms open as he approached. "Welcome, friends," he called, his voice deep and warm. "You look like you've had quite the journey. Come inside. Let us take care of you." "See?" Sarah said, nudging me. "Nothing to worry about." "I'm telling you," Eric muttered under his breath as we followed the man. "This is how every horror movie starts." The man introduced himself as Samuel, the leader of what he called our little family. He led us into the farmhouse, where a long wooden table was set for dinner. About 20 people sat around it, their faces lit by lanterns and soft smiles. They greeted us like old friends, pulling out chairs and filling plates with soup, bread, and fresh vegetables. "Please," Samuel said, gesturing to the food, "eat. Rest. You are our guests tonight." As we ate, he asked about our journey, nodding thoughtfully at our answers. His presence was calm, almost hypnotic, and for the first time that night, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Then I noticed her. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her dark eyes fixed on me. She was younger than most of the others, her long black hair falling over her shoulders. There was something in the way she stared, not curiosity, but intensity. Sarah noticed too. "She's staring at you," she said, her voice light but with an edge. I glanced away, but the girl didn't. When dinner ended, she approached. Her name was Anna. She spoke softly, her words directed entirely at me. She smiled when I answered, her hand lingering on mine for just a moment too long. "If you need anything," she said, her gaze holding mine, "just let me know." She didn't so much as look at Sarah. That night, as we settled into one of the small cabins near the edge of the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that Anna was still watching us. The first night on the farm felt oddly tranquil, almost too perfect. After dinner, Samuel personally showed us to one of the cabins near the edge of the property. It was small but clean, with simple wooden beds, handmade quilts, and a faint smell of lavender. The window overlooked the surrounding forest, where the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. "We're so glad you're here," Samuel said before he left. "Sleep well. Tomorrow, you'll feel like part of the family." The kindness felt genuine, but something about his words stuck with me. The next morning, the farm was alive with activity. Men and women worked side by side, tending to crops, milking cows, and repairing fences. They smiled and waved as we passed, their faces glowing with a strange kind of serenity. "You must be curious," Samuel said as he led us to breakfast in the main house. "We call ourselves the Fellowship of Purity. Our goal is simple, to live in harmony with the earth and with one another. We've left behind the chaos of the outside world, and in return, we've found peace." The others nodded along as if his words were gospel. It was hard not to be drawn in. His voice was calm, soothing, almost hypnotic. Jessica leaned over to me and whispered, "Is it just me, or does this place feel off?" Before I could answer, Anna appeared. She had a basket of fresh bread in her hands, but her eyes were fixed on me. "Good morning," she said, her smile widening as she placed the basket on the table. "Did you sleep well?" "Yeah, thanks," I said, trying to match her friendliness. Her gaze lingered on me, her smile a little too wide. "I'm so glad you're here. It's not often we get visitors like you." "Visitors like us?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. Anna's eyes flicked to Sarah, her expression faltering for a split second. "Oh, I just mean, you're all so interesting." "Thanks. We appreciate the hospitality." Anna tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was desperate to solve. "You're special," she said softly. "Too special for a place like this." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "But if you do die here, at least it'll be beautiful." Sarah jerked her hand away, standing abruptly. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Anna just laughed, a quiet, almost childlike sound, and walked away. The rest of the day was filled with subtle but unnerving moments. At breakfast, I noticed how the others at the table seemed to watch us as we ate, their smiles never wavering. Every bite felt like a performance under their gaze. Later, as Sarah and I explored the property, we passed a group of men sharpening knives near the barn. Their eyes followed us silently, and one of them whispered something under his breath. Jessica, always the sharpest observer among us, was the first to notice the carvings. They were etched into the wooden beams of the dining hall, the doors of the cabins, even the handles of tools. Strange symbols, circles, triangles, and spirals, interwoven in a way that felt deliberate. "This looks like something out of a cult," Jessica muttered as we stood outside the barn. "Keep your voice down," Sarah whispered. As if on cue, Anna appeared behind us. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and desperation. "Those are blessings. They protect us. You should be thankful." Her sudden presence startled us, but her words were what unsettled me the most. She didn't sound angry. She sounded devout. That evening, things took a darker turn. We decided to leave as soon as the sun went down. Something about the way Samuel and his followers watched us made it clear we weren't guests anymore. We were outsiders, intruders in their world. But when we walked back to the parking lot, the van was gone. "Where the hell is it?" Eric demanded, spinning around in frustration. Samuel approached us with his usual calm demeanor. "Don't worry," he said. "We moved it closer to the gate so it'll be ready to leave in the morning. It's already being refueled." "Can we see it?" Jessica asked. "Of course," Samuel said with a gentle smile. "In the morning." I glanced at Sarah. Her expression mirrored the unease I felt in my gut. That night, as we lay in the cabin, the unease became impossible to ignore. Sarah held my hand tightly, her breath shallow. "I don't trust them," she whispered. "Neither do I said. Eric, who'd been pacing by the window, froze. "Do you hear that?" We all fell silent. Faint whispers drifted through the air, too quiet to make out the words. They were rhythmic, like a prayer, and they seemed to come from just outside the cabin. Jessica moved to the door, peeking through the cracks. "There's someone out there," she whispered. I joined her, peering into the darkness. Figures moved between the trees, their shadows dancing in the moonlight. They were too far to see clearly. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Now." We packed what little we had and made our way to the door, but as soon as we stepped outside, they were waiting. 3 men, their faces expressionless, blocked our path. "Go back inside," one of them said. His voice was cold, emotionless. Eric stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We're leaving," he said. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, you're not." Before Eric could react, another man stepped forward and struck him across the face. He hit the ground hard, blood dripping from his nose. Jessica screamed, but it was cut short as one of the others grabbed her, twisting her arm behind her back. "Don't fight," the man holding her said. "It's better that way." They forced us back into the cabin and locked the door from the outside. For the first time, I felt true, bone-deep fear. I came to with the smell of damp earth and smoke filling my nostrils. My wrists burned, tight ropes dug into my skin. My vision was blurry, but as it cleared, I saw the flames of a bonfire crackling in the middle of the clearing. Around it stood the people of the fellowship, their faces illuminated by the fire's glow. Then I saw it, an altar. It was crude, carved from a single slab of wood and stained dark. I didn't need to guess what the stains were. I turned my head and saw my friends. They were tied to stakes driven into the ground in a semicircle around the altar. Jessica, to my left, was sobbing quietly, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Eric was to my right, thrashing against his bindings, his face red with rage. And Sarah was on the altar. Samuel stood over her, his face calm, almost serene, as he held a long, curved knife in his hands. He turned to the crowd and smiled. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady and full of conviction. "Tonight, we honor the purity of sacrifice. Tonight, we offer these outsiders as a gift to the earth, to cleanse our land and our spirits." I struggled against my bonds, but the ropes wouldn't budge. "Let us go, you sick bastard," Eric shouted, his voice hoarse. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Still full of fire, I see. Don't worry, my boy. That fire will burn out soon enough." He turned his attention back to Sarah, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she trembled beneath him. "You know," he said, addressing all of us, "you came here looking for adventure, didn't you? A little excitement to spice up your mundane little lives?" He smirked. "Well, congratulations. You found your destiny instead." The crowd laughed, a low, eerie sound that made my blood run cold. Before Samuel could continue, Anna pushed her way through the crowd. She looked frantic, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling. "Samuel, wait," she cried, her voice cracking. "You can't kill him." Samuel turned to her, his smile fading. "What are you talking about, child?" Anna pointed at me, her eyes wild with desperation. "Him. We can't kill him. He's special. Don't you see it? He's different." I froze as her words sank in. The way she looked at me, it wasn't just desperation. It was obsession. Samuel's face twisted in disgust. "You've lost your mind," he said coldly. "Go back to your place." "Please," she begged, falling to her knees. "I'll do anything. Just spare him. Take the others, but let him live." The crowd murmured, their unease growing. Samuel's expression darkened, and in a flash of rage, he backhanded Anna across the face. "Get out of my sight," he roared. Anna stumbled, clutching her cheek, tears streaming down her face. For a moment she looked at me, her eyes filled with something between love and madness, and then she turned and ran into the darkness. Samuel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Pathetic girl," he muttered. "Now, where were we?" Samuel moved to Jamie first. Jamie didn't say a word. He just closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as Samuel whispered something too low for us to hear. Then, without hesitation, he plunged the knife into Jamie's chest. Jessica screamed. Eric cursed, thrashing harder against his bindings. I just stared, frozen in shock as the light faded from Jamie's eyes. Next was Jessica. "No," she cried as two men dragged her to the altar. "You don't have to do this. Please, we can leave. We won't tell anyone, I swear." Samuel shook his head, almost pityingly. "The moment you stepped onto our land, you were chosen. This is the way it must be." Her screams echoed through the clearing as the knife came down. Eric was next. He fought harder than anyone, kicking and spitting as they dragged him to the altar. "You're all gonna burn in hell for this," he shouted, his voice raw with fury. "Every single one of you." Samuel smiled as he raised the knife. "Perhaps, but not tonight." Eric's last words were a curse, screamed at the top of his lungs, before the knife silenced him forever. I was next. Samuel's men untied me and dragged me to the altar, forcing me down onto the blood-soaked wood. I could barely breathe, the stench of death overwhelming. Samuel stood over me, his knife glinting in the firelight. "This is it," he said softly. "The final gift." I closed my eyes, waiting for the pain, and then I heard it. Sirens. The sound was like a bolt of lightning through the night. The fellowship froze, their serene smiles replaced by panic. A voice shouted from the trees, "This is the police! Drop your weapons and surrender immediately!" Chaos erupted. Some of the cultists pulled out rifles and began firing into the trees. Others scattered, disappearing into the darkness. In the chaos, the ropes around my wrists loosened. I scrambled off the altar, my hands finding the knife Samuel had dropped in the commotion. I saw him, crouched behind a wagon, barking orders to his followers. My vision blurred with rage as I gripped the knife tighter. I didn't think, I didn't feel, I just acted. I lunged at him, driving the blade into his back. He let out a strangled cry, collapsing to the ground. I didn't stop. I stabbed him again and again, my screams blending with his as I unleashed all my grief, my anger, my despair. By the time the police reached me, he was dead. They told me I wouldn't be charged. It was self-defense, they said. But it didn't feel like justice. The fellowship was dismantled, its members either dead or in custody. But they never found Anna. I sit here now, at Sarah's grave, the knife scars on my hands a constant reminder of that night. Sometimes when the wind rustles the trees, I think of her. I wonder if she's out there, watching me, waiting. She said she loved me. Maybe she still does, and that terrifies me. The Red Acre Commune. I'm writing this now because I don't know who else to tell. The cops won't listen. They say there's no proof of any crime, no evidence to back up what I'm saying. I don't blame them. If someone told me what I'm about to tell you, I wouldn't believe it either. It happened 4 years ago, in the summer of 2019. My little sister, Casey, had just turned 19 and was going through one of those find yourself phases. She was restless, eager to escape our small town, and spent most of her time online, talking to strangers in forums about spirituality, minimalism, and escaping the rat race. That's how she found them. They called themselves the Red Acre Commune, a group of about 30 people living off the grid on an old farm in rural Wyoming. Their website looked innocent enough. Pictures of smiling people working in fields, sitting around bonfires, and talking about freedom from modern society. Casey was hooked. She started messaging one of their members, a man named Jonah. He told her the commune was a safe space, a family where she could finally belong. He said they believed in self-reliance, love, and simplicity, and that they could teach her how to let go of the chains of the outside world. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. Casey left without saying goodbye. She took her car and a single suitcase, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. "I need to do this. Please don't try to find me. I'll be safe, I promise." I didn't believe her for a second. Something about the whole thing felt off. It took me 3 weeks to track her down. The address she'd given a friend led me to a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. At the end of the road was a gate made of rusted metal, with a hand-painted sign hanging from it. "Welcome to Red Acre. Visitors by appointment only." The place was eerily quiet. No cell service, no sounds of cars or even animals. Just an unnatural stillness that set my teeth on edge. I banged on the gate until a man came out of a nearby shack. He was tall, with long, greasy hair and a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for my sister," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Casey Morgan. She came here a few weeks ago." The man's smile widened. "Casey's fine," he said. "She's one of us now. But we don't allow unannounced visitors. You'll need to leave." I refused. I told him I wasn't leaving without seeing her. After a long pause, he nodded and opened the gate. "Stay close," he said. "We don't like strangers wandering around." The farm was bigger than I expected. Rows of crops stretched as far as I could see, and a cluster of wooden buildings sat near the center. A barn, a few small cabins, and what looked like a meeting hall. I noticed people watching me from the fields as we walked. They all looked hollow, thin, pale, with vacant eyes that seemed to pass right through me. When we reached the meeting hall, the man told me to wait outside. He went in, closing the door behind him. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the door creaked open and Casey walked out. She looked different. Her hair was shorter and she was wearing plain clothes, baggy pants, and a beige shirt that hung off her like it didn't belong to her. "Casey," I said, reaching for her. "What the hell is going on? Are you okay?" She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was strained, unnatural. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I'm happy here. You don't need to worry about me anymore." I tried to argue, but she kept repeating the same things. She was happy. She belonged here. This was her new family. The man stood nearby, watching us with his arms crossed. After a while, he said, "Visiting time is over. You should go." But I wasn't leaving without her. That night, I parked my car down the road and waited until the farm went dark. Then I climbed the gate and slipped inside. I found Casey's cabin easily. It was one of the few with a light still on. I tapped on the window, whispering her name. When she opened it, I told her we had to leave. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "They won't let me." She tried to close the window, but I grabbed her arm. That's when I saw the bruises, dark, circular marks, like fingerprints, wrapped around her wrists. "Casey, what are they doing to you?" I demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "They're watching," she whispered. "They always watch." I pulled her through the window, and we ran. We didn't make it far. Halfway to the gate, lights flashed on behind us. I heard shouting, footsteps pounding on the dirt. Before I could react, something slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. When I looked up, 4 men were standing over me, including Jonah. Casey was screaming, begging them to let me go, but they dragged her away as I fought to get up. Jonah knelt beside me, his voice calm and cold. "You don't belong here," he said. "If you come back, we won't be so kind." He pulled something from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. Then they left me there, bleeding and gasping for air. When I looked at what he'd given me, my stomach turned. It was Casey's necklace, the one she'd worn every day since our mom died. The police didn't believe me. By the time they searched the farm, Red Acre was gone. The fields were empty, the buildings abandoned, as if no one had ever been there. Casey's body was never found, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I'll hear footsteps outside my window. And in the morning, I'll find her necklace lying on the ground, exactly where I left it. The last gathering of the Morning Veil, March 3rd, 2004, Black Hollow, West Virginia. The official police report called it the Black Hollow Incident, Locals still whisper about it, and if you dig deep enough into old newspaper archives, you'll find a single article buried in the obituaries. What no one talks about, not officially anyway, is what they found in that burned-out church. The Morning Veil was a small religious group that operated out of an abandoned Methodist church deep in the forest, miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't much at first, just a handful of people, mostly drifters and loners. Their leader, a man named Elias Ward, claimed to be a prophet. By all accounts, Ward was charismatic, soft-spoken, and eerily convincing. Witnesses who met him described the way he looked straight through you, like he already knew every secret you were trying to hide. He spoke in low tones, but his words carried weight, even when he wasn't saying anything particularly profound. The group wasn't violent. They didn't protest or preach. They just kept to themselves. Most of the townsfolk in Black Hollow forgot they even existed after the first few months. That is, until people started disappearing. It began with a hiker. A young woman named Rebecca Moore went missing on February 21st, 2004. Her car was found abandoned on the dirt trail leading to the church. The last time anyone saw her, she'd stopped at a gas station asking for directions. The cashier later told police that Rebecca had seemed nervous. She'd mentioned meeting someone, a friend of a friend. 3 days later, another man disappeared. This time, it was a delivery driver named Greg Hensley. He'd been sent to drop off a package near the same forested area, but his van was discovered parked on the side of the road, engine still running. When Sheriff Bill Cranston and his deputies went to investigate, they found the church. It wasn't hard to miss. The building looked like it had been pulled straight out of a nightmare. The windows were covered with wooden boards, and symbols were etched into the rotting planks. Faint trails of ash ran in spirals around the foundation, leading into the surrounding woods. Sheriff Cranston later described the scene in a written statement. There was a smell, something foul, like rotting meat mixed with burnt wood. It wasn't coming from the church itself, but from somewhere nearby. We didn't know what we'd find, but none of us were ready for what came next. The deputies forced their way inside just after dusk. The sun had set, leaving the forest pitch black. What they found inside the church made 3 of the officers quit their jobs within the week. The pews had been moved to the edges of the room, forming a wide circular space in the center. Dozens of crude effigies hung from the ceiling, all of them made from twisted branches and human hair. At first, they thought it was animal hair. Then Deputy Lawson noticed a golden locket hanging from one of the larger effigies. Inside the locket was a picture of Rebecca Moore. The walls were painted red, not with symbols, but with words. Over and over, the same sentence: "The first light will burn us clean." In the middle of the room was a massive iron pot. Something bubbled inside, thick and black like tar. The smell was overpowering, and when one of the deputies leaned closer, he screamed and dropped his flashlight. Later, when questioned, he refused to describe what he saw. Sheriff Cranston ordered the building evacuated, but before they could leave, they heard something. A voice. Faint, low, almost melodic. It came from beneath their feet. When the deputies found the trap door, they hesitated. None of them wanted to be the first to go down. Eventually, Cranston volunteered. His deputy followed with a flashlight, though its beam barely cut through the darkness. The cellar was cramped and damp, its walls lined with shelves that held more of those horrifying effigies. And in the far corner, tied together in a huddled mass, were 12 bodies. They were alive, barely. The missing hiker, the delivery driver, a handful of others who hadn't even been reported missing yet. All of them were emaciated and covered in scratches, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. When Cranston tried to untie the first victim, she began thrashing wildly. Her eyes rolled back, and her body convulsed as though something invisible was tearing her apart. "Leave them," a voice whispered from the darkness. Cranston later swore that it wasn't human. It didn't sound like it came from any single direction. It was just there. When they climbed back upstairs, the room was empty. Every deputy who had stayed above ground was gone. The church burned that night. No one admitted to setting the fire, though Cranston always suspected one of his men had done it out of sheer panic. The bodies of the Morning Vale cult members were never recovered. Elias Ward's name disappeared from every public record. His face was never seen again. But there's one detail no one in Black Hollow ever forgot. In the ashes of the church, the words, "The first light will burn us clean," were written one final time, perfectly etched into the stone floor. And at exactly 5:37 a.m., just before the first light of dawn, 12 bodies were found standing upright in a circle in the center of the ruins. Their mouths were sewn shut, and their eyes were wide open,